thank you all for being here. Very nice for you to come on such a critical issue to our nation's future. The need to modernize our federal environmental review and permitting processes are something we've talked about endlessly, both to grow our economy and also to improve our environmental stewardship. So I'm really excited about this hearing. Our witnesses will share their valuable perspectives and set the stage for the EPW's committee work on this important topic. To ensure we take a holistic view of these issues, we will keep this morning's hearing record open until March 21st to give all stakeholders the opportunity to share their experiences with the existing environmental review and permitting processes, identify challenges, and then hopefully to suggest potential solutions. For too long, critical projects such as energy and infrastructure projects, along with industrial projects as well, have been trapped in a cycle of redundant reviews, shifting goalposts and regulatory uncertainty. In my home state of West Virginia, I've seen firsthand how these drive up in costs, these delays, not just for the projects, but for the American families who are paying for more energy, housing, and food as a result. Meanwhile, businesses lack the certainty necessary to make long-term investments, which can mean lost jobs, missed economic opportunities for communities, scarcity, and higher prices across the nation. It can also mean that the projects needed to deploy renewable energy technologies. It can also mean that projects needed to deploy renewable energies or to restore the environment are also stilted. The framework for our environmental review and permitting process is grounded in landmark laws under this committee's jurisdiction. NEPA requires federal agencies to consider environmental impacts on federally funded projects or before implementing their project. Other environmental and resource laws like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Endangered Species Act rely on permits and operational requirements to ensure that critical projects are able to come to fruition in environmentally responsible ways. However, years of changes in guidance and regulations, administration to administration, and a complex web of judicial rulings have resulted in ever-expanding hodgepodge of often duplicative and contradictory requirements. While this confusing and complex body of administrative and common law has grown over the past century, Congress has not stepped in to provide the holistic clarifications and modernizations. In the absence of congressional action, certain parties have found creative ways to use the judicial process to delay, remand, or strike down projects and raise costs to discourage project sponsors from moving forward. As a result, environmental review and permitting processes have increased costs and delayed or stopped projects, including projects that would help achieve the goals in our environmental laws. Last week, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee heard testimony from Nucor about how the need to obtain a Clean Water Act permit triggered significant delays based on required reviews under the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. These permitting delays nearly thwarted what will be among the most environmentally friendly steel production facilities in the world, and that will employ over 1,000 people in Mason County, West Virginia. It literally took an act of Congress to permit the Mountain Valley Pipeline to move clean natural gas from West Virginia to our southern neighbors, and I'm sure they're loving it today as the temperatures are dipping. I heard it's 2 degrees in Austin, and it's snowing to beat the band in West Virginia right now, so it's cold everywhere. What is it in, I don't even...
47 below.
47 below, okay. Sorry, Austin, you just got tripped. Okay, Quarter H and Coalfield Expressways, 2 top highway priorities for the state of West Virginia that would improve safety and mobility, have both encountered multiple permitting delays under various environmental statutes. West Virginia waterline extension, broadband projects, bridge replacements have all faced federal permitting delays, and I'm sure my state is not unique. The problems we will explore today have been brewing for decades. However, this Congress, we have an opportunity, I think, to deliver meaningful bipartisan legislation that addresses these problems. I'm committed to working with Ranking Member Whitehouse, our colleagues on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and those House committee counterparts to produce a bill with meaningful reforms. Durable and implementable environmental review and permitting process reform must be bipartisan, to be successful. My guiding principles for this effort are straightforward. The legislation that we develop must help all types of projects, not just politically favored projects or projects that will support the infrastructure needs of some Americans, but not others. We must provide clarity and transparency in the processes. And finally, our legislation needs to look at every stage of these processes to find efficiencies while balancing public health, the environment, and the needs of our economy. Let me be clear, modernizing these processes does not mean cutting corners or weakening environmental and public health protections. It means making the processes more efficient, more predictable, and more transparent so that the processes are not stuck in bureaucratic purgatory or endless litigation. Hardworking Americans, small businesses, and entrepreneurs want a government that works for them, not one that keeps them waiting for the benefits that many of the projects promise to bring in their communities and household budgets. So I look forward to the discussion today and learning about our witnesses' experience. I'm hopeful that we can hear some consensus on the issues that this committee must focus on in our attention so that we can develop our legislation. With that, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, beginning the effort together to deliver real solutions for the American people. And I now yield to the ranking member, Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Off we go again on the bipartisan journey to catch the elusive white whale, permitting reform. This hearing's witnesses will highlight the challenges people face building a variety of projects, but as Chair Capito said, we want more. We'll keep this record open for that month to make sure we hear from all interested stakeholders about their experiences and their recommendations. Help us find where you encountered barriers and what solutions have worked well. We also know that permitting reform is not exclusive to our committee, so the Chair and I are already engaged with our colleagues in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee and in the House. A word of warning, however, Democrats cannot agree to any permitting reform unless and until the Trump administration ends its lawless disregard for congressional authority and judicial orders. Billions in obligated funds remain frozen behind a fog bank of silent executive contumacy, in blatant disregard of constitutional separation of powers, direct court orders, and basic principles of law. I have to note, as a former U.S. attorney, I'm particularly disgusted with DOJ, where things are so bad that deeply conservative career prosecutors have resigned rather than carry out corrupt orders from Trump cronies. But it's everywhere, and it's hurting people and projects. Until the administration shows that it will honor its oath to faithfully and impartially execute the laws, we can have zero confidence that any legislative compromise on permitting reform will be executed lawfully. It falls to my Republican friends to bring this lawless, unconstitutional madness to an end, and I wish them good luck in that. On energy, we have particular reason to doubt the Trump administration will faithfully execute any permitting law we pass. The president has declared a fake energy emergency, despite record production in America, and he's defined energy to exclude renewables, the fastest-growing energy sector, all after receiving minimum $100 million from fossil fuel donors. We are deep into a political quid pro quo paid for by the world's biggest polluters, and China is chortling at the spectacle. I don't see a path to getting a bill until this lawlessness stops, and I don't see a path for a bill that excludes offshore wind, an industry with great jobs, huge growth potential, and a supply chain that already extends into 40 states. The men and women building these projects do not want them stopped, as General President Booker can attest. Coastal states don't want them stopped. Leasing has occurred in federal waters off nearly every coastal state. Nor do the industries that support offshore wind, the Louisiana shipyards, the Midwest factories, the ports like Quonset, generating economic growth across our country. And neither do consumers, who overwhelmingly want cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable energy. Why would we want to pull America out of the clean energy race when investment last year topped $2 trillion, far exceeding investment in fossil fuels? What fools we'd be. If you want a future driven by Chinese innovation, Chinese industry, and Chinese power, keep it up. But you can't change the fact that the future of energy is clean and that if we're not part of it, we'll be left behind. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, projects that peak demand will grow by 15% for summer peaks and 18% for winter peaks over the next 10 years, raising concerns about energy shortfalls, as our chair has pointed out in prior hearings. What would reduce the risk of those shortfalls? Better permitting. We need to build out a grid to meet current and future demand. 70% of transmission lines are more than 25 years old and showing their age. We know what we need to do. We need to build and fast. Right now, thousands of electricity generation projects are awaiting approval to connect to the grid. As of last April, 2.6 terawatts. Millions of engineering, construction, and manufacturing jobs stalled, in part because of our inability to build transmission lines. This must change. As I said last week, we have entered the era of climate consequences. The stuff the scientists warned us would happen is happening. Snicker all you want about Green New Deals. Ignore all you want collapsing coastlines, glaciers, coral reefs, and fisheries. Pope Francis said, slap Mother Nature, and she will slap you back. The economic slapback is here now in skyrocketing home insurance prices and failing home insurance markets. I will say it again, when climate havoc hits property insurance markets, it then hits mortgage markets, which then tanks property values so hard it can take down the whole economy. You may have missed it, but last week the Fed chairman in Senate testimony predicted that in the next 10 to 15 years there will be regions of the country where you can't get a mortgage anymore. When all that hits the fan, Americans will be very interested in who helped and who obstructed. Pretending solar and wind energy aren't even energy will look awfully dumb. And not permitting and building a clean, modern grid will look grossly negligent. So let's stop the lawbreaking and start the grid building together.
I like that last word. That's good. Our first witness is Jeremy Harrell. Mr. Harrell is the CEO of ClearPath, a nonprofit which advocates for policies that reduce global energy emissions. Mr. Harrell has served in a multitude of energy and environmental advisory positions on Capitol Hill, and he is the chair emeritus of the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council's Board of Directors. So, Mr. Harrell, I recognize you for 5 minutes. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chairman Capito, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Ranking Member Whitehouse and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jeremy Harrell, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ClearPath. America is at the dawn of a new era of unprecedented energy demand, fueled by robust economic growth, a revival of American manufacturing, and advances in AI and quantum computing. These developments have presented new challenges, yet offer immense opportunities for our country to build big. The regulatory process is not only unpredictable, but it is also one of the largest barriers to meeting energy, climate, and economic development goals at the federal, state, and local level. In the face of skyrocketing demand growth, building more energy resources has become more urgent. We need to let America build. NERC reported that annual demand growth rates are nearly double those of the last decade, when roughly 3 projects were added to the grid per day. But to meet that demand, we may need to build around 6 projects a day, or 16,000 facilities by 2035, and we'll need a broad suite of technologies to do it. These challenges are present in nearly every sector of the economy, from energy to housing to transportation projects. To be clear, the solution is not a development free-for-all. The regulatory environment must balance speed and safety, but the solution requires step change reform, not tweaks around the edges. Reforms that demand accountability and promote good outcomes as fast as possible should start with 3 key objectives. 1, leverage innovative American technologies. 2, expedite reviews. And 3, streamline judicial review of administrative actions. First, Congress could require more accountability, provide more transparency, and direct the use of modern technology. There is a clear need for more reliable information from federal agencies, ranging from the number of permits under review to how long they've been stuck in limbo. In many cases, federal agencies are not even using the same systems or terminology. More transparent data will help with accountability and provide the public with information to participate. Congress should also consider the role of AI, machine learning, and other state-of-the-art technologies to reduce the burden of project reviews. Our system is still stuck in the 1990s. Technology reforms are the lowest hanging fruit for bipartisan action. Second, we must expedite the review process. Faster approvals for projects that bring net benefits and comply with existing environmental laws are essential to meeting our nation's needs. Congress could expand categorical exclusions to permit projects. CADXs are a one-time determination under NEPA that certain activities do not warrant the substantial data collection and review that come with site-specific EAs and EISs. However, they still require agency decisions for each site. There is bipartisan support in Congress to accelerate low-impact energy projects like geothermal exploration to eliminate redundant reviews. A permit-by-rule approach could also offer significant benefits, balancing administrative speed with safeguarding public health, safety, and the environment. To do this, the criteria must be well-defined, periodically reviewed, and aligned with the overall regulatory framework. Encouraging development in certain pre-qualified geographic areas could also accelerate projects. Previously disturbed lands or well-characterized areas like brownfields present opportunities to leverage electrical and mechanical infrastructure. The impacts of this development are minimal in most cases and are in or near the communities that need the economic growth the most. And lastly, the judicial review of agency actions must be reformed. The current system is tilted towards those who seek to delay or block projects. For example, a recent analysis found litigation delayed fossil energy and clean energy projects by an average of 4 years, and agencies won 71% of those challenges. Separately, an analysis on transmission projects found 24% of projects that completed environmental review faced litigation, and the agency won 88% of those cases. If major infrastructure projects are regularly delayed by legal challenges that are ultimately overturned, it is time to reassess whether our current system is protecting consumers or protecting project opponents. Congress could consider limiting legal challenges to plain errors related to the natural resources laws, narrowing the scope, and setting strict review timelines. Without changes, our nation is needlessly undermining our own economic development and climate goals. In conclusion, the U.S. is in a global competition for energy leadership. China and Russia are deploying billions of dollars around the world to advance their geostrategic interests, to control the sector, and connected supply chains. We must overcome our regulatory challenges to counter these efforts and meet domestic energy, economic, and environmental needs. It's time to let America build. Thank you.
Together. It'll be
I like that.
You like that? Okay.
Yeah. We
Our
may be
next-
onto something with that.
Our next witness, is Leah Pilonis. Did I say your name properly? Thank you. General Counsel for the Associated General Contractors of America. Over her 25 career with AGC, Ms. Pilonis has served in multiple leadership positions, including as Senior Environmental Counsel and Associated General Counsel for Construction and Environmental Risk Management. She is also a host of AGC's Constructor Cast podcast. So I now recognize Ms. Pilonis for her opening statement.
Thank you very much. Chairman Capito, Ranking Member Whitehouse, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I appreciate your leadership and bipartisan efforts to improve the federal environmental review and permitting processes. These efforts are critical to ensuring that we can deliver much-needed infrastructure projects in a timely and cost-effective manner while maintaining strong environmental protections. As General Counsel at the Associated General Contractors of America, I have learned how delays in environmental approvals don't just hold up projects. They cause workforce instability, drive up costs, and jeopardize investments in critical infrastructure. These delays also impact the communities that rely on these projects for jobs, economic growth, and modern, safe infrastructure. We need to ensure timely project approvals, minimize litigation risks, and maintain economic growth. Here are 4 ways Congress can help. 1, establish a uniform judicial review period. NEPA lawsuits can stall projects for years, even after they have undergone extensive environmental review. Litigation is increasingly being used as a tool to obstruct critical projects. This undermines planning, increases costs, and deters investments. While Congress has protected some infrastructure projects with a 150-day legal limit on challenges, most construction projects remain vulnerable for lawsuits for up to 6 years under the Administrative Procedures Act. AGC urges Congress to standardize the 150-day limited judicial review period for all critical infrastructure projects and eliminate unnecessary procedural hurdles that create prolonged uncertainty. Once a project receives final environmental approval, it should not remain in legal limbo for years. 2, align environmental reviews with congressional intent. The Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act was designed to streamline environmental permitting and prevent unnecessary delays. However, CEQ's latest NEPA regulations contradict these reforms. Congress must hold agencies accountable to ensure NEPA implementation stays true to the FRA's intent and does not add new layers of bureaucracy that undermine project delivery. 3, prevent regulatory fragmentation. Recent court rulings and executive actions have highlighted the lack of clarity on NEPA implementation. Without clear statutory direction, agencies may adopt conflicting rules, making projects even more vulnerable to court challenges and forcing courts to interpret the law in a post-Chevron environment. Congress must act to ensure a consistent, reliable framework for environmental reviews across agencies. 4, make permitting reform a durable bipartisan legislative solution. Permitting rules should not shift with each administration. Congress must ensure agencies implement reforms consistently, and Congress must provide oversight to prevent regulatory overreach. The U.S. Supreme Court's Sackett decision provided much-needed clarity on federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. However, the current conforming Waters of the U.S. regulations still fail to align with the ruling, creating uncertainty and unnecessary delays. AGC urges Congress to hold agencies accountable for properly implementing Sackett as intended. I want to share a few other ways Congress can help reduce Clean Water Act 404 permitting delays. Protect general permits, codify key exemptions, such as for roadside ditches and stormwater features, expedite jurisdictional determinations, ensure mitigation requirements are reasonable and backed by adequate mitigation credit availability. AGC supports bipartisan permitting reforms and urges Congress to ensure agencies follow congressional intent. Cutting red tape and limiting unnecessary litigation will help deliver critical infrastructure projects on time and on budget. Most importantly, Congress must provide certainty by ensuring that once environmental approvals are final agency actions, projects should not be threatened years later. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is Carl Harris. Mr. Harris is the chairman of the board for the National Association of Home Builders. He has been building homes for 40 years in Wichita, Kansas. At Carl Harris Company, the firm he founded in 1985 with his father and sister. We want to thank him for spending time with us this morning before he heads to the NAHB International Builder Show later this week in Las Vegas. I will now recognize Mr. Harris for his opening statement.
Chairman Capito, Ranking Member Whitehouse, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. As a small business owner, I understand the immense challenges that our members experience as they navigate the permitting process, because creating homes for Americans starts with successful permitting. The U.S. has a shortfall of over 1.5 million housing units, and the easy places to build homes have already been laid out, which means the nation's home builders are going to increasingly run into environmental permitting regulations for undeveloped land. We want to improve this regulatory process so that home builders can accomplish two fundamental goals: safeguarding the environment and creating attainable housing for Americans. Regrettably, American home buyers are suffering through a record low housing attainability. According to NAHB's Priced Out study, 77% of buyers are unable to afford just the median price of a new home. every small price increase has a sharp exclusionary effect. And on average, every $1,000 that gets added to a home's cost locks out 106,000 households will be priced out of the market. Uncertainty and delays in permitting needlessly add costs to the construction process, which increases home prices and pushes the American dream away from others among the market. While the Clean Water Act serves as a crucial foundation for protecting the nation's waterways, the implementation of certain aspects of Section 404 and mitigation bank approvals are a major source of frustration for our members. Let's consider a property owner who wants to build homes on undeveloped land. They want to know if the water features on their property fall under federal jurisdiction. To determine this and avoid federal penalties, they need an approved jurisdictional determination, an AGD. Unfortunately, obtaining AGDs are not prioritized under the Army Corps and take well over a year to obtain. Rather than languish waiting for an AGD, home builders will roll the dice and try for a quicker preliminary jurisdiction determination, known as a PJT. But a PJD has several hooks. It's not appealable. It allows water features to be considered jurisdictional, even if they're not covered by the Clean Water Act, and can preclude the use of the nationwide permit. We should be able to tell home builders if there are federal jurisdictional features on their property without forcing them into the problematic PJD. Congress created the streamlined nationwide permit under Section 404, which is meant to be completed within 60 days for minimal impacts on water features. But members routinely report that it's taking almost a year to obtain these, which is rivaling the time it takes to complete the more rigorous individual permit required for larger environmental impacts. This timeline is unacceptable for a permitting tool that is meant to be fast and predictable. Digging deeper under the 404, we have the Waters of the U.S. rule, which has been subject to litigation and administration changes. This nonstop whiplash has confounded our members about which water features on their property are federally jurisdictional, with key regulatory terms like continuous surface connection and relatively permanent water that have been left undefined and open to interpretation based on which Army Corps district you're in. This lack of harmony promotes confusion and uncertainty. As part of the 404 permitting, builders are often required to purchase mitigation credits to offset the impacts to wetlands. For example, a member in Ohio told us that the credits for his project cost about $140,000 due to the 2-to-1 mitigation requirement. When you break it down per home lot, this adds $10,000 to the cost of a new home. A driving force behind these exorbitant credit prices is the shortage of mitigation banks across the nation. It's extremely challenging for bank sponsors to come online, which disincentivizes participation. This leaves home builders competing against others over limited credits and drives up the cost. To be able to build the millions of housing units needed across this nation at an attainable price, the residential construction industry needs a more clear and predictable environmental permitting process. We need to prioritize the AJD process, recenter the nationwide permit, and encourage mitigation bank creation are all the ways we can do to chip away at this problem. I thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is Brent Booker. Mr. Booker is the General President of the Laborers International Union of North America, and he is a third-generation member of Laborers Local 795 in North Albany, Indiana, and started his career in Leona's mailroom. Mr. Booker also served as director of the union's construction department and in various positions with North American building trades unions. I welcome you, and I now recognize you for your opening statement. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Capito, Ranking Member Whitehouse, and members of the committee. My name is Brent Booker, General President of the Laborers International Union in North America. LIUNA was founded over 120 years ago by immigrant workers fleeing their countries to seek not only a better life, but the American dream. Today, we're a strong, proud, diverse union representing over 530,000 workers across the United States and Canada. LIUNA members go to work every day, building and maintaining our nation's infrastructure. From our endless highways, bridges, and tunnels, to city skyscrapers, water treatment centers, to our nation's vast energy sector, our members' jobs touch every American's day-to-day life. Our nation's boom in energy production has provided an abundance of jobs for our membership. Our union has always promoted an all-of-the-above approach to energy production, renewables, oil and natural gas, hydro, nuclear, because we build it all. As union laborers, we take pride in our work. We're the safest, most productive, and well-trained workforce in the world. We get jobs done right, on time, the first time, safety, and on budget. LIUNA was deeply involved in both federal and state permitting. When we know a project will be built by hardworking laborers, we embed ourselves within the project's regulatory process to ensure it's approved in a timely manner. We're the folks in orange shirts you see at public utility hearings and community meetings. That's because in our business, predictability of projects is crucial. Our members move from job to job, stringing together the projects that over many years build their career. While we believe in a responsible approach to permitting infrastructure projects, it's clear that our current permitting process is broken. Whether it's purposely stalling the NEPA process or filing what feels like countless frivolous lawsuits, leaving projects in limbo and our members wondering when they'll get paid next. A project could be permitted, fully funded, and ready to go, then out of nowhere get hit with a deluge of lawsuits and get shut down. Unpredictability equals unemployment for our members. These projects aren't political to them. They're pathways to a middle-class way of life that include family-supporting wages, good health care benefits, and the ability to one day retire with dignity. If our members don't go to work, they don't get paid. So when a project is delayed months or even years, well, you try delivering that message to someone who has a mortgage payment due or has to buy school supplies for their kids. Adequate judicial review timelines must be included in any permitting reform package. Over the last decade, the pipeline industry, predominantly within natural gas, has provided thousands of laborers tens of millions of work hours. And as we continue to expand into more advanced energy sources, such as hydrogen and carbon capture and utilization, it's clear our training and skill sets will be vital to a cleaner energy future. And now we're seeing these same issues within the renewable sector. Since the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, offshore wind has been a tremendous contributor of jobs for LIUNA members. Between the harbor and port build-outs to turbine construction to the installation of turbines themselves, all along our nation's coastlines, LIUNA members are building offshore wind projects at a rate like never before, including America's first offshore wind project and Rhode Island's Block Island. Unfortunately, the administration's halt on offshore lease sales has upended the wind production market and has led to projects completely withdrawing their construction plans, costing laborers their jobs. One project is a Starboard Wind project, a 1,184-megawatt project proposed by Ørsted about 30 miles south of Martha's Vineyard, which was expected to power upwards of 600,000 homes. This one hits home for me. I was proud to have helped negotiate and implement the National Offshore Wind Agreement back in 2022 on behalf of the building trades. This agreement was going to bring back thousands of good union jobs to workers across the country. Now, many of these projects are at risk of being terminated, causing us to lose significantly more jobs than we did on the Keystone XL pipeline, once again leaving our members high and dry. We must put an end to projects for being used as pawns on a political chessboard, because it's American workers that pay the price. With the simple swipe of the pen, or lack thereof in this case, these decisions impact the lives of the members we proudly represent and their communities. If you take away one thing from my testimony today, please let it be this. It's LIUNA members who go to work every day, building the America we all use. Whether it's turning the lights on in the morning or commuting to work on a highway, it's likely a laborer had a hand in it. This isn't about politics. It's about ensuring we continue our energy independence and dominating in a market that when we don't compete, allows us to fall to our adversaries. For LIUNA, above all, it's about ensuring our members are able to go to a job that affords them the opportunity to be firmly entrenched in the middle class. And to be clear, these aren't just jobs. They're careers that give our members and their families a chance to thrive. They're paychecks that ensure American workers are contributing to their community and aren't forced to rely on the government to make ends meet. They're lifelines that allow construction workers to retire with dignity after they've built the America we all enjoy. For LIUNA members, these projects are delivering on the promise of the American dream which is why I thank you for granting me the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Appreciate it. And finally, our last witness is Nicole Pavia. I say that correctly? Thank you. The Director of Clean Energy Infrastructure Deployment at the Clean Air Task Force. She is responsible for leading the organization's infrastructure team and previously worked in consulting, concentrating on energy and sustainability projects, and she is a fellow Duke University alumna.
That's right.
A Blue Devil.
That's right. Chairman Capito, Ranking Member Whitehouse, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Nicole Pavia, and I'm the Program Director for Clean Energy Infrastructure Deployment at the Clean Air Task Force, or CATF. CATF is a nonprofit, non-ideological advocacy group with nearly 30 years of experience in advancing policy and technology change needed to achieve a zero-emissions, high-energy economy at affordable cost. In my role, I lead CATF's work to identify and address barriers, be they regulatory, permitting, financing, or social, holding back deployment of clean energy technologies at the pace and scale we need to decarbonize. One of our priority technologies is electricity transmission. Long-range, interstate, and interregional transmission lines are critical pieces of our energy system, and we are not building enough of these lines to meet reliability, security, affordability, load growth, and clean generation needs. Today, significant wholesale electricity price differences between and within regions exist due to transmission system congestion. Regions afflicted by severe weather are unable to access enough electricity from neighboring regions, leading to economic damage and, tragically, loss of life. And 2,600 gigawatts, or 2.6 terawatts, of energy capacity, 95% of which is zero-emitting or storage capacity, sits in interconnection queues today, waiting for an opportunity to plug into the grid. The cumulative effect of our inability to modernize and update our transmission system is reflected well in North American Electric Reliability Corporation's latest long-term reliability assessment. Most of the North American bulk power system faces increasing resource and energy adequacy challenges, just as projections show increasing demand growth. Given these urgent circumstances, why have long-range transmission investment and deployment rates decreased and not increased over the past decade? Some have pointed to federal transmission permitting processes and environmental review processes under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, as key culprits, but little evidence and data existed to understand the truth of these claims. Therefore, CATF partnered with the Niskanen Center to start to build the evidentiary record around the drivers of delay in the federal transmission permitting process. We consolidated and analyzed publicly available data and interviewed developers, permitting officials, and other expert stakeholders. As explained further in my written testimony, environmental reviews under NEPA can certainly be improved. But fundamentally, we found that the provisions of NEPA are not to blame for the most significant delays and inefficiencies in transmission deployment. The most frequently cited slowdowns were largely process and resource-oriented. Most stemmed from gaps in leadership and federal agency coordination, lack of steady appropriations for permitting-related tasks, insufficient permitting expertise at agencies, data inaccessibility, and local opposition to and lack of state support for nationally beneficial projects. These are not all permitting-specific blockers, but they often flare up throughout the course of the permitting process. Another issue is the regulatory differences between jurisdictions through which long-distance transmission lines may pass. Lines crossing state or tribal borders are not subject only to federal permitting requirements, but also to the requirements of all state and tribal governments traversed. These requirements can be uncoordinated or duplicative, and state and tribal resource constraints for permitting are evident. Overall, prioritization of a modernized, secure, and resilient transmission network will require a departure from the status quo. This includes reforms to the federal review process, but it also requires addressing the key drivers of transmission delay as identified in our report. In addition to speeding permitting timelines, we should be increasing specialized agency capacity to efficiently execute permitting. And we should consolidate siting and permitting authorities for interstate transmission projects in the national interest under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, just as they are for interstate natural gas pipeline projects. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And I'm going to begin with a question for all witnesses. I believe I know the answer to this one, but both Republican and Democrat administrations over the last couple decades have recognized the need to address the environmental review process, and those administrations have taken efforts through changes to regulations and guidance to do so. Despite these efforts, federal environmental review and permitting challenges persist. So this is a yes/no. I would like to ask each of you, do you agree that Congress must come together to develop a bipartisan bill to tackle these challenging issues? Mr. Harrell, we'll just go down the line there.
Yes, Senator.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Good. Thought I knew the answer to that. Ms. Pilonis, under current law and regulation, projects can take years or even decades to progress from concept to completing the NEPA process. And what are the real-world impacts of this lengthy timeline for projects on consumers of goods and services that your members produce?
Thank you, Senator, for that question.
And then, Mr. Harris, I'm going to go to you with the same question. Go ahead. Excuse me.
For the construction industry, delays cause uncertainty, and they also cause workforce instability. Our contractors can't commit to hiring workers. They can't order materials when there are delays on breaking ground for projects, often because they're tied up for years with lawsuits. Delays also drive up costs. They increase project costs as inflation and material shortages make projects more expensive over time. Delays also increase investments. Delays are preventing AGC members from building our quality of life and delivering safe projects that are going to benefit communities.
Cross country. Mr. Harris, your home building.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The cost of permitting adds to the cost of housing. And every time, as I said in my testimony, every time you raise the cost of a house $1,000, you lock out 106,000 family units. That's substantial. You know, we speak about the value of home ownership. Well, the value of home ownership is good for everyone. It stabilizes families, it stabilizes neighborhoods, it stabilizes communities, employee bases, volunteer bases. Home ownership is a public good. And in trying to increase or make better the processes for permitting, then we can decrease the cost. The time value of money for developers, home builders add to the cost of a house. And right now, where we've seen the average cost of a house go up $90,000 in the last 2.5 years, we have locked so many people out of the American dream.
Thank you. And I know there's a shortage as well, so we can get into that maybe later. I want to ask about judicial review. It came up in almost everybody's testimony. Many projects are targeted with litigation all throughout the process. The resulting legal costs and project delays can be enough to stop a project, which happened with our Atlantic Coast Pipeline in West Virginia. Mr. Booker, will you describe some of your members' experience with litigation after EIS or EA is finalized? You have your permits at hand, and then you can't go forward. You kind of outlined it in your statement saying you can't pay the worker if you can't move forward. Could you just expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, you don't get paid unless you go do work, right? And you have to have a project to do that. And you also can't just pull a laborer off a shelf and say your project starts next Friday.
Right.
We have to prepare for that. We have to train. We have joint labor management training that, depending on the project, whether it's a pipeline or with offshore wind or any other energy sector, we have to train people to do that. In order to do that, we have to have predictability. So this litigation as unpredictability it creates chaos in the construction industry, and it doesn't allow us to get the safest, most skilled, most productive workers if we don't know when that job's going to start, or if we are expecting it to start in a month and then it gets delayed by 2, 3, 4 months. So that litigation is causing chaos, and chaos in the industry. Also, it's causing our members not to get paid. Right. And that's the biggest thing. For us, it's about jobs.
Right.
It's about us to be able to get people, their paycheck.
Right. Ms. Pauconis, can you elaborate on that in terms of, is there a specific stage of the court process that is particularly challenging, or is it just through the whole, you mentioned it can be as long as 6 years, but it can be probably longer than that if you can drag it through court.
Correct. We know that NEPA is the most litigated environmental statute. We know that the amount of lawsuits that are being filed is increasing. We know from current studies and data that it can take multiple years, up to 4.5 years, to make your way through the litigation process where it's resolved at the appellate level. Lawsuits can stop projects that have already broken ground in their tracks through the form of injunctions. Studies that have been done, whether it's through an EIS, an EA, or using a categorical exclusion, those decisions can be sent back to the agencies, which is delaying breaking ground. Essentially, we keep having do-overs even after you've received the project approval. There's really good language that Congress and this committee has already passed in statute to put some limits on litigation. MAP 21 has a 150-day statute of limitation window. We are recommending that that be applied to all critical infrastructure projects. There's also great language in FAST 41, but that's only applicable to a small number of projects that opt into the program. But that language requires challengers to raise concerns early in the process where there is a lot of opportunity for public comment for working these things out on the front end and not dragging projects into long litigation years after.
Right. And before I go to Mr. Senator Whitehouse, I will say, you say if you're sending it back to agencies for reconsideration, you're running into the problem that Ms. Pavia said came out in their survey, which is, I don't want to say lack of expertise, not enough capacity to really move these through the different agencies quickly. So, Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman. President Booker, welcome. Thank you for mentioning project labor agreements. You had a project labor agreement with one of the offshore developers. We have seen the huge success of project labor agreements in Rhode Island. It aligns the interests of the workers with the interests of the developers. Your orange shirts do show up, as you said, and things get built on time, on budget, and done right. Indeed, America's submarines are built in buildings in Quonset, Rhode Island that were constructed under a project labor agreement. So thank you for flagging that. With respect to the 7 offshore wind projects that are now at a standstill, how many jobs do you estimate those would have supported?
Thousands. From what the actual work in the water that will be, from the port upgrades, the harbor upgrades. We're building vessels in this country again to support offshore wind. So it's in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of building trades jobs, laborers jobs, and tens of thousands of related jobs to that.
And when an ongoing project is put on a standstill, do you have a sense of what that means for the consumer at the end of the day?
We're losing power in the country, right? We need a base load of power. We need predictability in power. So not only are my members suffering from not being able to go to work every day, we're also not being able to plug in that power into the grid that we have, that we need.
Thanks. Ms. Pavia, you've mentioned at the very end of your testimony discrepancies between the existing treatment of pipelines under the Natural Gas Act and the existing treatment of transmission lines under the Federal Power Act. Could you real quickly let me know where those areas are, and maybe for the record, put a list together of where you think those should be harmonized?
Yeah, sure. So there are definitely differences between FERC's authority over interstate natural gas pipelines and transmission lines. The Natural Gas Act, Section 7, gives FERC full siting and permitting authority over interstate natural gas pipelines. Alternatively, the Federal Power Act in Section 216 creates national interest electric transmission corridors that can be created through the Department of Energy, and FERC has a limited authority to site projects only within those specific corridors. Right now, the Department of Energy is going through the process of designating those corridors, but there are only 3 of them so far. And what we see from the differences between the natural gas regulations and the transmission regulations is that—
If you don't mind making a list, so I have to use all my time on this one question.
Oh, yeah, no, the transmission—
Thank you. Mr. Harrell, You say a looming transmission shortage poses a direct threat to America's energy security. You recommend that permitting new lines will be absolutely necessary. You also suggest that there are ways to move more electrons over existing power lines. How would you balance those things? How much growth can we have in grid availability from moving more electrons over the same lines versus how much are we going to need to solve by actually building new?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and for your leadership in these areas. We need both when push comes to shove. The scale of the amount of building that we're going to have to do over the coming decades here is immense. New transmission and increasing the capacity of the existing infrastructure is going to be critical for everything.
Where the big new progress is mostly likely to be made? Is it going to be more in building new, or is it going to be more in new technologies that allow electrons to run more smoothly over existing infrastructure?
Given the scale of rising demand, we're going to need to build significantly more energy infrastructure, transmission, and pipes.
But you don't have a sense of which one part new, electron efficiency, 3 parts new transmission. You don't have a.
If I made an educated guess, a 75-25, we're going to need to build out more infrastructure around.
That's what I figured. A couple of things in my last minute that you can all respond to as questions for the record. One is, I have come to despise interagency process. I really can't stand it any longer. It is a terrible excuse for the executive branch to dawdle and fiddle around and have things move at the speed of the most recalcitrant agency. And it's also a place where things go to die, and in an accountability-free zone, because at the end of the day, when whatever was in the interagency process fails, everybody walks away and there's nobody who was responsible for that. So if you have thoughts on what we could do in Congress to turn interagency process into an efficient mechanism for coordinating these agencies, which is what we need, rather than an executive branch excuse hole for not getting things done and not having anybody accountable for that failure, I'm happy to hear from all 5 of you on that one. The last thing is, very often, and we saw this particularly in offshore wind, we got the first steel in the water and the first electrons on the grid in Rhode Island on offshore wind because we had engaged with obviously interested stakeholders right from the get-go. Too often, the federal regulatory process and state regulatory process begins with a filing from somebody who wants to develop something who hasn't lifted a finger to go out and talk to the folks who are going to be affected. The first offshore wind permit that was sought at the federal level was catastrophically bad in that respect. I haven't even talked to fishermen about which direction you should array your equipment. They just were trying to jam it through on the strength of the pressure of their investors and the desire to get the electrons ashore. So if you could also talk to me, and to the degree of precision that you can, about in what regulatory processes there should be a filing requirement stating what you have done to identifying the stakeholders and saying what you've done to run the project by them and get their preliminary input so you start in a better place. So I went over, my apologies, but if we can get those 2 things, I'd appreciate it.
All right, Senator Kramer.
Well, first thing I'm going to get is that last 6 minutes and send to all my Republican friends, and so they know why I like working with Sheldon Whitehouse so much. I'm like, wow, this was... Anyway, all that, so thank you all for being here. Thank you, Chairman Capito and Ranking Member Whitehouse, for having this really important hearing so early in the term. Because there's a lot of work to do, and as we've learned, it takes a while. There are 2 areas I really love to explore, but I'm going to start with you, Ms. Pilonis, and Mr. Harrison, really all of you, but you spoke most thoroughly on the topic that isn't anywhere in my prep, but it gets me right to this issue of the capital intensity of these projects is, I think, lost oftentimes on a lot of folks. And even, I mean, to the point of workers. I mean, labor can't just sit on the sidelines and wait for the years to go by. But what I want to ask about is the Supreme Court, and you referenced Sackett, and either you or Mr. Harris referenced the fact that the Corps of Engineers still hasn't adequately responded to that ruling. And prior to Sackett, there was West Virginia versus EPA, or as I like to say, West Virginia, North Dakota versus EPA, and the major questions doctrine. There was the repeal of the Chevron doctrine. All of these are such clear messages that the bureaucracy does not have the power that they think they have and that they've been exercising. And the fact that Sackett wasn't clear enough in the definition of jurisdictional waters, that the durable rule that the administration came up with in response to it was, don't worry about those 80,000 404 permits. Maybe 79,800 of them really weren't necessary, but you should at least ask us first. And you referenced the process. My question is this: what part of this, or why do we even have to seek jurisdictional determination or permission when we know, when anybody can read any home builder can read the law and go, this isn't a jurisdictional water, I don't need a 404 permit. In other words, we don't put a highway patrolman on every car on the interstate just in case one of them speeds. We presume most of them are not going to violate the law. Where am I wrong on this, Ms. Pilonis? Where am I wrong on this, and how can we simplify it?
So the problem is that it's not clear, and you can ask one person if something's jurisdictional and the next person if something's jurisdictional, and you might get two different answers. So for the construction community, we need clarity, and it's very difficult to move forward when you don't know what is a water of the United States. Not getting a permit when you are in federally controlled water has very significant penalties, civil and criminal penalties, and so the consequences and what's at risk is huge for the developer, for the contractor. Sackett did provide some guardrails. It provided some clarity, but what came out of that Supreme Court decision is not being implemented by the agencies. There, as Mr. Harris said, there are very unclear terms that have not been defined in the regulations, and that's what's causing a lot of confusion.
Mr. Harris, elaborate.
Thank you, Senator. Along with clarity, we need consistency. We need consistency between the core districts. If we could get true definitions of the terms that we were talking about, then our builders, our developers would know when they could take reasonable risk before they make a tremendous investment in both the property and start moving the dirt. So we do need that consistency and clarity.
But one thing's for sure is that they can't be the same as they were before Sackett, right? That there's certainly many fewer jurisdictional waters than there were previous to Sackett. So you really, as long as there's a 1% chance that it's jurisdictional, you're almost obligated to your shareholders, to your customers, to your workers, to seek the federal government's permission to obey the law. And I mean seek their permission to allow you to obey the law, which is mind-boggling. Okay, we only have a minute left, and I only have a minute left, and we'll explore some more if we get another round. But on the electricity side, because this is the hard work. And I think one of the challenges and one of the things that we oftentimes forget, and this gets to cross, purposes, I suppose, is that electricity is the generation, transmission, distribution in a largely monopoly world of electric consumption, and where where it gets very iffy is that somebody determines those rates. There are regulators that determine those rates, and transmission and generation being built out absent a planning process by the local utility can put the tab on the wrong people real easily. And there's a solution. We have to find a solution. We have to find a federal backstop. But I think on linear, I think the ranking member's point, linear siting for transmission lines should be the same as it is for a water pipeline or any other linear infrastructure. And I think we can do that, but we do have to recognize those state regulators having been at one point, and the governors, and it's just going to be a lot harder, and we'll talk about it in another round if we get a chance. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm glad we're holding this hearing today to discuss the long overdue need to fundamentally re-examine how the federal government handles the permitting processes. I think it's important to start by saying that there are very good reasons why our bedrock environmental laws exist. The Clean Air Act improves our air quality and has been shown to prevent childhood asthma and other respiratory problems. The Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act make sure that rivers, lakes, and sources of drinking water aren't full of unhealthy pollutants. And requirements to review the long-term impacts of infrastructure development on federal land ensures that we protect our national parks and monuments and forests for future generations. And I believe there is bipartisan agreement that having these protections for public health and for our environment are an appropriate thing to do. The question then is whether our current framework allows us to accomplish the goals of these bedrock statutes without needlessly delaying common sense projects. A few years ago, I traveled to Taiwan to visit with some businesses who were considering expanding their microchip manufacturing, but also their clean energy businesses into the state of Arizona. And while I was touring one of their tech parks, I think it was on the northern side of the island, our guide pointed out that right there in the middle of the park was the government permitting office. And our guide shared that anytime a company needs a new air or water permit or land use permit or anything else, they could go to that office and that the staff there would help them get the permit they needed. By contrast, these businesses shared how confusing the U.S. permitting process was. You know, why did they have to work with the city or the county government on their land use permit and then talk to 2 or 3 different federal government agencies about air, land, and water permits? These businesses, they were prepared to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in the United States and create thousands of great-paying jobs, but our permitting process led them to delay or scale back the planned investments. It's not that these businesses wanted to skirt clean air and clean water protections. They just wanted to be able to understand that their requirements, like what the requirements were, and have certainty that once they met those requirements, they wouldn't need to deal with years of lawsuits. So, Mr. Harrell, at a more macro level, can you describe how federal permitting processes create uncertainty for businesses looking to make investments in the United States? And what are the opportunity costs for our current permitting system?
Thank you, Senator Kelly, and thank you for your leadership on critical infrastructure and trying to drive forward these investments into our country. Time is money when push comes to shove, and ultimately companies are evaluating how the process to operate in this country impacts their investment and the returns they're ultimately getting a long-term project. And today, the process is particularly unpredictable, and so there's a wide range of factors that developers have to factor in when they evaluate. And so the desperate need to provide more certainty in the process, to show us kind of the sideboards of how long it could take if it is a particularly complicated project, because sometimes it is, and how do we maximize the resources that are being invested. I mean, I think a great example is your work on the Chips and Sciences Act and the regulatory reforms that were needed to catalyze and build out those chips. That regulatory predictability allowed private developers to move resources faster, but ultimately didn't sacrifice significant environmental outcomes.
Thank you. And Ms. Pavia, so as I mentioned in what's going on in Arizona, most of the economic development, the projects there that we're attracting are for clean energy industries and just, you know, few things like microchip and battery manufacturing is most of it. And as we as a nation look to encourage more clean energy manufacturing, how does our current permitting system affect that development?
Thank you. Yeah, in the context of transmission permitting, uncertainties in the transmission permitting process actually hinder the interconnection of clean and zero emitting and storage capacity resources. As I mentioned, we found that 2,600 gigawatts of clean energy is sitting in interconnection queues today. So the challenge there is to unleash that potential in those queues.
And it's in a queue because there's no transmission available because the permitting is held up.
That's right. That's right. The permitting process is not keeping up with the deployment rates of transmission that we need to unlock those resources.
All right, thank you. Let's fix that.
Okay, Senator Curtis.
Chairman Capito, Ranking Member, White House, thank you for holding this hearing. As I've been sitting here today, the best analogy I can think of is it feels like we're on a train and we all know it's going to wreck, and everybody on the train has the answers, right? I mean, we could take these 5 witnesses and the few members that are here, if you'd lock us in a room, and I think we could get to this. So I'm grateful. There's hardly a topic that's discussed more in Washington and is acknowledged as bipartisan, yet we can't get it across the finish line. So thanks for your work and working with our House colleagues. I pledge my support and anxiousness to help you in this matter. Mr. Harrell, I'd like to, first of all, give you a shout out for the work you do in your organization. As you know, it's been very, very important in my understanding of these issues. And I want to talk just a little bit about Utah. Utah strives to be a leader on this. We have Operation Gigawatt that showcases the state's interest in geothermal and nuclear and all these energies. And geothermal, it'd be hard to find an energy source that finds better agreement among everybody that this is something that's important and needs to develop. And yet, we struggle with permitting. And so I want to ask you, what additional measures could the federal government take to support state-led efforts in expanding geothermal, particularly in a state like Utah?
Yep. Thank you, Senator Curtis, and thank you for your leadership on these issues over the course of your time in Congress, and excited to see the next big things here in the Senate as well. It underscores a really key point, and Utah is a great example nationwide of where federal, state, and local entities need to be synced up in the right way to drive new economic opportunities. And so Project Gigawatt, focusing on how to leverage and grow new geothermal, new nuclear, new hydrogen development potentially in the state. And I think there's 4 key things that I think could be particularly helpful for the federal process to sync up with that Utah strategy. On the geothermal side, I think a no-brainer is remove the duplicative environmental analysis that's required for geothermal exploration. We should streamline that process. There's a bipartisan bill in Congress considering that. And then if a site is feasible, it's still going to have to move under an environmental process for the generation project. So let's take the pure exploration environmental analysis out of it and kind of unleash innovators in that space. I think there's a lot that we can do to streamline permitting at existing facilities that have been closed, at brownfields. I know your state is looking significantly at deploying small modular reactors and microreactors that could unlock significant development in the state. We're going to have to resolve some of these frictions with federalism, both on pipelines and transmission that are out there to tap building out infrastructure for new hydrogen, for example, in the state. And so there are some key things that I think will solve problems that we're seeing nationwide, but really will help unlock the Utah strategy.
So I'm going to come back to transmission. You've talked about it. It's been talked about a lot here. And yet, just like the other parts of permitting reform, we're not making progress. I think I'm going to stereotype Republicans here a little bit and say that that we do struggle with this, right, in the whole aspect of permitting reform. Talk to me, and particularly my Republican colleagues, about transmission. What is it that we're not getting? What is it we need to know, and how do we get this done?
I think it's about growing clean energy infrastructure as a whole. We need to build out more wires, and that's not just about renewables. There's projects that have been stifled by the judicial process that are connecting and putting new gas facilities on the grid. If we're going to deploy new small modular reactors and advanced reactors, the scale of rising demand and the amount of new generation we're going to have to build, potentially as big as the size of the Texas grid at a minimum over the next decade, potentially doubling the U.S. grid over the next decade, we're going to need to connect a lot of new resources in place. And ultimately, that means streamlining federal reviews, trying to find ways to make that process move more quickly, and then providing some more clarity to the judicial process. I mean, transmission projects have seen significant delays. I mean, there's multiple transmissions projects in this country that have nearly turned 21. So.
Well, listen, there's some good proposals out there, and I'd just like to invite my Republican and Democratic colleagues. I'm anxious to work on this and be helpful and see if we can find a solution. Mr. Harris and Ms. Pilonis, I was the mayor of my city. When I think of building regulations, I tend to think of the city, county, and state regulations. I think a lot of people don't really understand that federal adds yet another layer of regulations on this. Can you both just speak quickly to that federal layer that people may not see?
As a recovering mayor myself, part of a 12-step program, recognizing I had a problem and knowing there's a higher power, it's not me. No, I am, and I currently sit on my Planning and Zoning Commission. So I know that of the 24% of the cost of a new home that's directly related to government regulation, that local and state governments share in that responsibility to make sure that the permitting process at all levels is efficient.
I'm almost out of time, but I'm sure they'll give you just a quick response.
Sure, I'd just add that where you can delegate or assign responsibility to the states, it can help streamline the process, such as through NEPA assignments, or where states can take over 404 permitting. Many states have done that with the 402 stormwater permitting process, and that can reduce duplication. And we've heard from our members it can very much streamline things.
Thanks, all of you, and I yield my time.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you and Ranking Member Whitehouse for this timely hearing. In California, we talk a lot about permitting, but I think it's important to note at the outset that permitting isn't just a bureaucratic hurdle. There's a purpose for the process, and it's the foundation of responsible infrastructure development, energy production, and environmental protection. They're not mutually exclusive. They got to go together. And there are a number of important bipartisan reforms, like last year's Energy Permitting Reform Act that Congress should pass. I'm sure it's been raised earlier in the hearing. But I also believe the committee needs to grapple with the fact that a big challenge that was just exacerbated is actually staffing. Right? Policy is policy, paperwork is paperwork, but people are people. And we need to be clear about how instead of ensuring our federal agencies have the staffing levels necessary to process permitting applications as expeditiously and responsibly as possible, what we've seen in the early days of this Trump administration through the so-called Department of Government Efficiency is actually freezing and firing at unprecedented levels the workforce that we rely on for permitting. Ms. Pavia, you touched on this in your testimony, but can you discuss how staffing levels and capacity writ large are impacting the permitting process?
Absolutely. So in our study, which we conducted over the course of 2023 and 2024, it was published in April of 2024, one of the main challenges that we heard from developers, from agencies, from across the spectrum, was the lack of specific permitting and transmission knowledgeable staff available at the agencies and at field offices for those agencies. An anecdotal piece here, we talked to a developer who said that if they couldn't catch one person in particular at a field office, that would add months to their permitting timeline. So the importance of staffing is really, really critical. You can set timelines for things, you can set deadlines, but at the end of the day, if there aren't people there available to do the work, it's really hard to get the work done.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it certainly seems that by shrinking the workforce, we're doing the opposite of achieving energy independence or energy dominance. So we have some work to do. Now, as some of you may know, I'm a member of both of this committee as well as Energy and Natural Resources. And so I come at it from both angles, the commitment and the priority of streamlining and reforming the federal planning process to meet the energy demand and ensure the reliability of the electrical grid. Now, transmission is an essential part of the reliable, efficient, and affordable grid, and it's often a factor, the factor, physically constraining new grid interconnection requests. According to the NERC, the limited addition of interstate electric transmission infrastructure poses a grid reliability, particularly with a growing population and a growing economy. Ms. Pavia, follow-up question. In your testimony, you point to the misalignment in requirements between different jurisdictions with permitting authority as a key factor in slowing down transmission permitting more specifically, would requiring interregional planning that ensures regions jointly address needs and align on priority projects help minimize any misalignment? And what other recommendations might you have?
I do think that that would help. FERC Order 1920, for example, requires more longer-term regional transmission permitting, transmission planning processes and cost allocation. I think that looking further out as a region and thinking about all of the affordability, reliability, and other challenges that might be faced would encourage the planning of longer distance transmission lines. So I do think that these coordination efforts will actually help resolve a few of these issues. However, transmission permitting jurisdiction, as you noted, really lies with the states. And so there still needs to be state-to-state harmonization and state and tribal harmonization, along with the general harmonization of state transmission permitting policies with federal transmission permitting policies.
Well, just underscoring the biggest point of all, which is we all have to work together, because federal jurisdiction's federal, state is state, but ultimately we're physically and legally interconnected. So thank you for your thoughtfulness. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Chairman Capito and Ranking Member Whitehouse, for holding today's important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today to share your experiences as well on what we need to do to reform our federal permitting process. I believe we can make common sense permitting reform to unleash the projects for the American energy, infrastructure, home building, agriculture, all those sort of things, while protecting our environment. Permitting reform is about modernizing our regulatory system to ensure that we're deploying projects efficiently, not about undercutting environmental standards. Regulatory delay for permitting infrastructure, energy, and environmental projects is a hidden tax on Americans. This Congress, I'm excited to serve as chairman of the Fisheries, Water, and Wildlife Subcommittees. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Endangered Species Act, and Clean Water Act are within the subcommittee's jurisdiction. In Nebraska, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers often finds itself in the middle of all these important policies. In addition to maintaining waterways and providing power, the Corps is responsible for flood prevention and to protect both natural and built environment. Conflicting statutes like the Flood Control Act of 1944 and the Endangered Species Act actually pit protecting human life and property against protecting wildlife and the environment. Complicated court history and administrative actions relating to the devastating flood events along the Missouri River has made even the most common sense projects to prevent avoidable and anticipated flooding difficult to permit. The lack of clear congressional intent and direction has compounded a difficult situation and authorized unintended priorities and created new environmental programming. Situations like this can be found all across the country. Western wildfire victims, biofuel proponents, and residential developers find themselves navigating the same impossible regulatory scheme. We do not have to settle for years-long court battles, bureaucratic backlogs, and complex statutes at the expense of natural resources and safety. The Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 reformed the National Environmental Policy Act for the first time in 50 years to mandate timelines and page counts for environmental analysis. The FRA also streamlined the use of categorical exclusions, which should expedite the deployment of CEQ-approved activities. As governor, one of the things I did to be able to help streamline this was implemented a process called Lean Six Sigma, and I know the chairman's can't get through any sort of hearing without me trying to mention Lean Six Sigma when we're talking about permitting reform, because this is one of the things we did that, again, shouldn't be controversial. It's about streamlining the process, which we've been all talking about here today. So, for example, we can't change environmental regulations to the state, but we could look at the process. It was 110 steps long, for example, to issue an air construction permit. We cut that down to 22 and cut the time delay down from issuing that permit from 190 days to just 65 days. Those are the kind of reforms that are possible thanks to the great staff we had in Nebraska. And actually, one of those folks, the gentleman who ran my Department of Environment and Energy, Jim Macy, has the Region 7 EPA administrator. So I'm really pleased to see him doing that. The point is we can do this. Ms. Pilonis, you talked about some of the conflicting regulations maybe agencies are doing. I mentioned the Flood Control Act and the Endangered Species Act. Can you give me some examples of laws or regulations that are conflicting that we may need to address to be able to provide clear congressional intent so that the courts will have that when they're making these decisions?
I think the clear congressional intent is most important, having clear statutory language that lays out Congress's intent, making sure that that's carried out and implemented by the agencies, and for Congress to be able to step in when agencies are showing overreach or they're causing conflicting or inconsistent determinations. As far as where there are conflicts, I mean, we've got, NEPA, the overarching statute, bringing all the resource agencies together at the table to try to analyze and assess what the impact of a proposed major action will be. The idea is having coordination and communication and discussion about how these programs align, and so that you can do concurrent reviews instead of sequential reviews and end up having the monitoring, the studies, the work that you're doing satisfy all of the programs so that you can reach one final document.
Just off the top of your head, can you think of, are there specific conflicting laws that we need to address through this process, or are there specific agency regulations that we need to address through this process?
I mean, what comes to mind for me is not so much conflict between the laws, but inconsistent interpretation of the laws at the federal agency level, and making sure that the application is consistent so that you don't have diverging different opinions. With NEPA and recent court decisions and executive actions, I mean, it is not clear what the long-term role CEQ will play in implementing regulations. We need to be sure that when federal agencies are implementing NEPA and carrying out NEPA through their own agency regulations, that we don't have inconsistency. And so that's an area that we are focused on moving forward, and ensuring that agencies carry out NEPA consistently per the statute.
I think we'd all agree that that consistency is going to be important, especially when it comes to the interpretation. Is there something this committee can do along those lines as we're thinking about reform, things that we ought to be putting into the statute to be able to accomplish that?
I think making sure that terms are clear. As Mr. Harris talked about with the Clean Water Act, I mean, we've got language in the regulation that is being inconsistently applied. With NEPA, great work was done in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, being clear that you're analyzing reasonably foreseeable effects, that you're looking at reasonable alternatives that are technologically and economically feasible. How is that being implemented? And Congress having oversight and stepping in where agencies are implementing that inconsistently.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In California, really the top issue is housing, the lack of housing, lack of affordable housing. It is fundamentally a supply problem. We just don't have anywhere near enough housing, and we can move people off the streets into shelter, but if we're not building more housing and building it quickly, there'll simply be new people taking their place on the streets. So my question, let me address it to you, Mr. Harris, is what can we do to accelerate the building of housing that's affordable? How much of the challenge in terms of the timeliness or lack of timeliness in approving new projects is a federal problem, and how much of it is a state and local problem? And if it's more a state and local problem, are there things that we can do to incentivize local government and agencies to get to yes quicker on new housing?
Senator, thank you very much for the question. It's something that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts. We believe it is a supply problem, that the inventory is driving up the inflationary cost of shelter. And we think that of the 24% of the cost of a new home is related to government regulation, about, I don't know, a quarter of that is probably state and local. I mean, is federal. The remainder is state and local, and they're handling the heaviest part of that. When I have the opportunity to talk to lieutenant governors and governors that are saying, look, we need more housing in our state. I encourage them to look at the policies and procedures that local and state governments have in regard to housing. Have they updated their housing plan? Have they put barriers in place to keep the growth or disincentivize growth happening in their communities? And it's the same way could happen at the federal government. The federal government used highway dollars to get the speed limit regulated. They've used federal dollars to raise the drinking age. So I believe that if the federal government was to look at incentivizing these communities, either in applications for CDBG grants or any of the federal dollars that flow to municipalities, if they have consistent pro-housing, pro-growth opportunities, then I think that would incentivize them to do that, Senator.
Well, thank you. I look forward to working with you to identify how we can facilitate at the federal level, but also incentivize the local level, getting approvals of new housing more quickly. Mr. Booker, I wanted to ask you about offshore wind. We have two big offshore wind projects, both in Humboldt and Morro Bay, and I'm concerned about the rash of cancellations we're seeing of offshore wind projects in the last couple of years, and the new administration's executive order blocking leasing for offshore wind projects. I really don't understand the point of that. It's going to kill a lot of jobs and reduce a lot of energy. Is this the suspension of leasing, is this just designed to be a gift to the oil industry? Why would we want to stop offshore wind and all the jobs and the energy that creates?
Yeah, and I'm probably not the right guy to answer that question. But what I will say is that killing of offshore wind jobs is killing of American jobs. You know, this president, this administration talked about, you know, creating American jobs, the American dream. And when we start picking winners and losers of renewables versus oil and gas versus nuclear versus hydro, the end result of that, if a political appointee, is deciding who wins and who loses, at the end of the day, it's the American worker that loses if someone is chosen, if one industry is chosen after the other. That's why we've always been all of the above. We support all of that. We support American jobs. We support American workers. And I would encourage this administration to not pick winners and losers in the energy sector and let the market dictate where it makes sense. On the East Coast and the West Coast, offshore wind has made sense. It's been an economical, viable, energy source that's creating good American jobs.
Well, thank you. And finally, on the transmission interconnection issue, this seems to me one of the biggest areas where we could really move forward with a lot of new energy projects and clean energy projects. Last year, California's grid operator, known as CAISO, stated that its interconnection queue now contains more than 3 times the generating capacity needed to achieve all of our state's renewable energy goals, 3 times the amount needed. How do we get that transmission working? And in particular, I'm curious, a lot of projects that apply to join the grid, they end up essentially dissolving even before they get the opportunity. Is that because of the delays in access to the grid, or is it because you have all these projects applying to the grid that are not necessarily financially viable or don't have their funding? Why are those projects falling out, and what do we do to get the grid working so that when you have a new project, it can come online in a time-effective way?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. There are a lot of projects that apply to the queue just to get in line. They might not be, 100% ready for deployment, but I think this all stems from a process that is very long because of the lack of transmission that is available on the other side. And there is a kind of chicken and egg problem as well, where you don't want to build a transmission line if you don't know that there's going to be generation on the other side of that line. You also don't want to put new generation into the queue if you don't think there's going to be a transmission line built. So there is kind of this chicken and egg problem as well that I think we have to address in interconnection specifically.
Yeah, and I know combining these two issues that in the Humboldt area where they have an offshore wind project, they're trying to figure out exactly that chicken and egg problem. It's one of the windiest places on Earth. There's some deep water challenges to that particular venue, but then they don't have the transmission capacity even if they built it tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Interestingly enough, until a couple of weeks ago, I was on the other side of this question as a lieutenant governor working in economic development in the state of Ohio. And I can tell you that the frustration that local and state leaders have with federal regulators is epic from my experience, because of the lack of certainty, because of the lack of understanding the process, because of one regulator may have a different opinion than another regulator, and the timelines of this are very frustrating. But I would ask the question of why we're having this discussion, because I think that we are saying that the regulatory regime we built to protect the environment and other important factors has become so large and unwieldy that is in conflict with other priorities, like the idea of Made in America, about creating more jobs in this country, about building a resilient supply chain in this country for our economic and national security, and everything from energy to computer chips to pharmaceuticals, whatever that might be. And the topic of time is money has come up. The saying time is money has come up several times today, which is so true, because we know that if you lack a predictable time frame for doing things, many people just won't invest. They won't take the risk of making those investments, whether that's in building chips or data centers or power plants. So the NEPA process, I can tell you that I've seen this happen so many times, where we had the CHIPS Act, for example. We need to build chips. Very much supported the federal government leaning in on this on a bipartisan basis. But the NEPA process extends out the time frame for which you can build the fabs. We say it's a national security priority, but then these regulations get in the way. We also hear, I left a community where they're currently discussing whether or not they'll have enough energy to meet the demand of Made in America, and can't know whether they can build the power plants or the supply chain. That's the regulations, and then the regulators on timeframes and deliverables. And the idea that literally slowing these things down is actually contrary to our economic, national security, and even environmental interests. When you think that unless you have enough energy that comes from whether it's gas-fired power plants or SMNR and wind and solar, that taking a longer time to build those means you can't decommission coal power plants because you don't have the energy supply chain. So, if you accept my context for my concern, quickly, I would love for every one of you to just tell me a couple things that you, just quickly, things that we should do to fix that.
Thank you for your question, Senator. Timelines are important, page limits are important. You did great work with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, putting those things into law. I think then it comes down to accountability and making sure that folks are held to that. There, in the Fiscal Responsibility Act is the requirement for agencies to report to Congress if they're missing those timelines, having oversight over that and making sure you're getting that information and understanding why deadlines are being missed. In MAP 21, there are actual penalties for missing deadlines. That only applies to surface transportation projects. I think having that apply to more critical infrastructure projects could hold agencies more accountable. FAST 41 created the permitting dashboard, which creates an incredible amount of transparency so that the public and everyone can see what are the milestones, when are they happening. There's only a few amount of projects, about 30 right now, that are on the dashboard, so having that apply to more projects. I think making use of general permits, there are ways to make sure that things are getting done more quickly through the use of categorical exclusions, general permits.
Senator Husted, I would urge think big. This is not an around the edges issue. As you point out, there's a lot of duplication. We've had significant new environmental statutes put in place after NEPA was enacted in 1969. We have to see how these things sync up together that provide more predictability, that modernize the system, and make step change reform, because I think it's clear the status quo is not serving our economic or our environmental interests.
I would like to say that just calling a tool or a permit efficient and predictable doesn't make it efficient and predictable. We need something that will be efficient and predictable every time.
I think we have to require agencies to make a decision, either up or down. And if the answer is no, then we can reapply for it. And then we've got to put timelines on litigation so that if a project is permitted and going and people are working, the decisions have been made by the agency, it's good to go, the litigations can't stop a project going forward.
I would second the use of the permitting dashboard. It's a great existing tool that we can continue to leverage more fully. And I would also just harken back to what I said earlier about staffing, both at the local and federal capacity for permitting expertise, especially for linear infrastructure projects, is going to be really important. The IRA did provide some technical assistance through programs like TSED, but I think more can be done in the capacity space.
Thank you.
Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for being here today. This is a subject that vexes people in both parties at all levels of government, so I'm thrilled that you're willing to address these issues today. I'm going to start with something called permit by rule, which is something that President Trump has touted in an executive order. I have a bill that would authorize permit by rule. My co-sponsor is Mr. Budd. It's called the Full Responsibility and Expedited Enforcement Act, the FREE Act. So my question is, Mr. Harrell, how can implementing permit by rule streamline federal permitting while ensuring robust environmental protections? And what steps should Congress take to ensure agencies follow up on these reforms?
Thank you, Senator, and thanks for your leadership on this issue. I mean, this is the type of think big item, right? How can we shift to a build and comply structure rather than this arduous multi-step process? In many cases, projects face unnecessary case-by-case reviews that aren't getting us any better benefits from for the environment. Purely is just driving out the length of the review process and driving up costs. That's not good for the consumer. It's not good for the environment. And so agencies are going to need to set out the rules of the road, which I think your bill lays out in the early stages. And then I think Congress is going to need to codify that, because in the end, this can't be a structure. This shift is a big change. It can't go on the ebbs and changes of an administration. We need a regulatory system that works for the next 40 years, not for the next 4 years. And this is the type of thing that I think we can take a significant chunk of projects off and streamline for projects that have like characteristics, are built in the same type of areas, or need to comply in the same way.
Yeah, I agree, Mr. Harrell. I don't think it's for every situation. But for a very standard situation that has consistent, replicable compliance standards, it might work well. So thank you. Look forward to working with you all on that. Mr. Harris, I'm going to turn to you. In Wyoming, we have a housing shortage. There's a community, very small community, Kemmer, Wyoming, where this TerraPower nuclear power plant is going to come in and have construction job demands that are going to require housing. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this issue, given your experience in small volume home building in a state that's very similar to my state of Wyoming.
Thank you very much, Senator, for the question. I think the community, the community needs to decide where the housing needs to go and then work together with builders and the federal authorities about what's the most appropriateness for that. You reduce those barriers and you'll start having more builders want to build homes either for rent, wherever they build on the housing ladder, whether it's temporary housing, apartments to first-time home buyers to move-up housing. All of that takes the cooperation. Real estate development is really community development and how we can all work together to get these houses built in the communities that need them.
So how can streamlining permitting help homeowners?
Well, it will lower the price because the cost of regulation continues to drive. So if I decide to, if I have to jump through a lot of hoops to develop a piece of land, then that increases the cost per acre or per lot that I'm going to need on that home. And then eventually that will be passed on to the home buyer. But each one of those regulations continues to work through that. The permitting process needs to be well-defined, consistent every time.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask one more question, changing subjects to something called Class 6. I invite any of you, I suspect maybe Mr. Harrell, this is for you, but any one of you is welcome to weigh in. States can expedite permitting by directly implementing federal requirements. There's something called Class 6 primacy that allows for that. Wyoming successfully applied for and received this Class 6 primacy, but I'm told that the EPA has 151 pending Class 6 permit applications, while only 4 have been granted. For any of you who's familiar with this Class 6, what reforms can ensure that states seeking Class 6 can navigate the process more quickly and with greater certainty?
Senator, I'm happy to hop in there. I mean, Class 6 primacy is an area where you're shifting responsibility to the folks who are closer on the ground, who can move more quickly, and the law requires them to still have the same environmental standards. So it's a no-brainer that we can move faster, bring those decisions back to the lower level. And there is probably no better example over the last 4 years, and particularly in clean energy, that shows that just throwing money at the problem isn't fixing it. Between the infrastructure bill and annual appropriations, EPA has gotten more resources to process these, and they continue to move at a palatial speed. Yeah. We've got to set clear timelines. They need to be more transparent about where they are in the process, particularly with states. It needs to be a more iterative process. If they see something in the state proposal that isn't meeting the federal standard to take on this responsibility, that needs to be up front. I think we can move much faster on this. It was exciting to see West Virginia get cleared here recently, and there are a bunch of states in the pipeline that I think could benefit from this. And then the federal regulators can focus on more complicated projects in places like California, for example, that aren't going to explore primacy.
And it is proving successful for states that have already received Class 6 primacy?
Your state, North Dakota, are two great examples. Wyoming and North Dakota are moving these projects in under a year, where the federal process, as you mentioned, has 150-plus projects in the pipeline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for to our committee. I appreciate your being here today.
Good to close up. Your permission to close, or does she want to come back out? Does the chairman want to come back up, or am I clear to do this? I hate to close her hearing. We're deciding whether this is the end of the hearing or not. The chair was kind enough to give me the gavel for purposes of moving through the members, but it's not clear that I have the gavel for purposes of closing out the hearing without her permission, so in the spirit of bipartisanship, I'm waiting for that signal. So if you'll all just stand by for a minute. Good to go? Okay, I have clearance to proceed. So first of all, thank you. This was a very, very helpful hearing. Senator Lummis, in the response from Mr. Harris, he mentioned the importance of the community making the decisions about where the housing should go. I think that aligns pretty well with a comment that I made earlier, that in these filing things, it would be helpful if there was right at the very front a requirement of who are the stakeholders and how have I engaged with them already, so that all doesn't get backed up into the regulatory process. It's done up front and center, and here we go. I didn't have to close out the hearing because the chairman is here. Didn't want to get in trouble.
My apologies for missing the last few minutes. I think we have a lot of commonality here, a lot of good ideas, and a lot of thought that I think are going along the same lines. And I think we should think big, and then come down from big to where we can meet the sweet spot. Because like Senator Curtis said, we've been talking about this for years, and we haven't quite gotten there. So I'm committed, and I know you are.
And what's our word?
Together, to work on this together. That was our key word today. So anyway, with no further questions, I would like to thank the witnesses and all of my colleagues for their participation. Senators who wish to submit written questions for the record have until 4 p.m. on Wednesday, March 5th to do so. The witness responses to those questions are due back to the committee no later than 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March 19th, and will be submitted to the record. The hearing record will remain open, as I said earlier, until March 21st, and anybody, I would hope that you would submit suggestions that you might have heard today or other suggestions. The public will be allowed to submit comments and materials for the hearing record by sending these documents to permitting@epw.senate.gov. This email address is also accessible on the committee's website on our contact page. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.